this is Desaliny. I'm following up the video I did recently on the punk grunge kind of indie rock compilations of the USA with this video today, which is all about pretty much covering the same period from about 1980 through to the mid-90s, but from a UK perspective. So the UK indie scene of the very early 80s was pretty different to the US, really, for a number of reasons. I mean, the punk scene, the late 70s punk scene, had opened up a lot of kind of avenues for people to release records independently. It had completely demystified the idea of recording and distributing your own records. There was a very active indie label scene. Also, the UK is geographically much smaller country than the US. Do a national tour quite easily if you were a small band, and also very much easier to get national coverage via music press or a national radio station. There were also kind of distribution networks that had been set up by several independent record labels themselves. This was called the Cartel, and it was kind of a cooperative effort by a number of labels, Rough Trade, Probe, Red Rhino, Revolver, Bax, whereby they would distribute one another's records in their own locality. So you had this kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours thing going on. Throughout the 80s, that was working fine. As we turned into the 90s, a bunch of those labels started to fold, and eventually the Cartel kind of ceased operating as a thing kind of in the early part of the 90s. The other thing with compilations from a UK perspective, from a UK indie perspective, is they weren't quite this kind of scene document thing that they may have been in the US. Because of the nature of the UK indie scene and all these labels being very active and having bands and promoting and sending them on tours and helping them record stuff, compilations were often really a marketing tool. They could be sold cheaply to generate more interest in, the bands on your catalogue, so that people would then go out and buy full price releases. So I did do a video a while back about the Enemy Indie City compilations of about 1988. If we rewind all the way back to 1981, we get to the kind of the big granddaddy of all these UK indie compilations, and that is C81, which was released through the Enemy with some help from Rough Trade. And this was the first of these kind of generational NME cassettes, just pulling together the kind of early post-punk indie alternative sounds of mostly Rough Trade artists. So Scritti Politti, their track The Sweetest Girl is the opening track here. But there's lots of other Rough Trade artists on here. Robert Wyatt, The Raincoats, The Blue Orchids, some international artists like Pere Ubu. There's also a good representation on C81 of postcard records artists. So you get Scottish bands like Orange Juice, their track Blue Boy. You also get Aztec Camera and Joseph K. Moving on to 1982, we have a compilation on Cherry Red Records called Pillows and Prayers. This was kind of a collection of post-punk stuff at a very cheap price. I think it was marketed at 99 pence. Consequently, it topped the kind of the indie album charts for weeks and weeks, 5-6 weeks plus, because it was just so cheap. And yeah, this featured kind of an array of indie kind of alternative artists, again, post-punks. So you had stuff from the Monochrome Set, you had stuff from Everything But the Girl, plus the two members of Everything But the Girl individually, Tracy Thorn and Ben Watt. You had Felt on there, you had the Marine Girls, you had the Nightingales, the wonderful Nightingales. Yeah, it's a good compilation. Still in 1982, and we get to Factory Records. Yeah, they didn't release that many contemporary compilation albums of the time. You find lots of retrospective ones after they'd folded, but at the time, they didn't really release that many of compilation albums themselves. Rather perversely, they did decide to release VHS video compilations. And so the one I'm going to bring up here is Fact 56, which is called A Factory Video, which consists of like specially recorded kind of pop videos, very low budget pop videos, and some live performances from a lot of the biggest bands on the label at that time. So you have performances from New Order, OMD, Cabaret Voltaire, Dorothy Column, A Certain Ratio. And you also get some really quite cool stuff from some of the lesser but still very interesting factory artists of that period. So you get tracks from Section 25, Crispy Ambulance, Stockholm Monsters. Yeah, so a VHS compilation. Around the middle of the 80s, we're just going to hit this big old chunk of again, NME issued compilations. There was one in 1984, NME 011, called Department of Enjoyment, and one later in the same year called Raging Spool. That's Enemy 014. Yeah, Enemy issued tons and tons of compilation cassettes on their covers for free, or for a nominal price sometimes. But these were often very kind of specific genre ones. So they would do like, you know, country ones, jazz ones, northern soul, African, electro. But both of these are a pair of kind of mixed compilations of Indian alternative artists of that specific period. Yeah, these don't get kind of brought up quite as much as some of their bigger kind of generational tapes, but there's some good tracks and some good names on there. On Department of Employment, we get Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, Perfect Skin. We get Girl Afraid by the Smiths, and there are tracks from the Waterboys, the Redskins, Billy Bragg. Yeah, Raging Spool, pretty much more of the same, just an eclectic mix. You get Mark Almond, you get the Go-Betweens, they sing in part company. You get Aztec Camera's cover of Van Halen's Jump. Yeah, Everything But the Girl, Cabaret Voltaire, Bronski Beat. Yeah, another one of those compilations. And again, a year later, 1985, Tapeworm, NME 017. You get The Pogues, you get Paul Quinn, you get Win, the Jesus and Mary Chain doing Inside Me. You get Simply Red, Frank Sidebottom covering the Pistols. A couple of US artists again. We get Trouble Funk, Los Lobos on this one. Okay, and so here's the, well, if C81 was the great granddaddy, this is the granddaddy, C86. This is kind of the second one that became one of these generational NME tapes. It's just a great snapshot of the mid-80s UK indie scene. You can see why it's got such a reputation. This one has been subject to kind of reissue across the years, you know, expanded deluxe versions, but the original one has a very kind of concise kind of sampling of the mid-80s UK indie scene. You get Primal Scream, you get the Soup Dragons, you get the Wolfhounds, Stump, A Witness, the Pastels, the Shop Assistants, Close Lobsters, Half Man, Half Biscuit, Big Flame, McCarthy, that was Tim Gaines' band before he formed Stereolab, and of course the Wedding Present. They close it with This Boy Can Wait. Yeah, I don't know what else you can say about C86. It's kind of quite a legendary compilation. So next up, 1987, and one of the most important of the UK post-punk indie alternative labels, 4AD. We get Lonely Is An Eyesore. Yeah, I think they'd done a few compilations before this, but I think this one's especially interesting because it catches 4AD at this kind of big turning point. They were kind of diversifying from this very precious sounding kind of material that they'd been releasing up to now, this kind of goth dream pop stuff. They'd gone heavily on kind of the early post-punk and kind of gothic rock stuff. So you get things like Bauhaus, Dead Can Dance, Clan of Zymox, Diff Juzz, This Mortal Coil, and of course the Cocteau Twins. But yeah, 87 was a year that I think things were changing a lot for 4AD. They just had a major hit with Mars and Pump Up the Volume. Mars containing several members of A.R. Kane, another band on the 4AD label. And yeah, things like dance and electronic and sampling was beginning to come to the fore. So artists like the Colour Box were being picked up on 4AD. And also there was a look across the Atlantic because they'd been quite kind of UK and European focused up until this point. And there was a whole generation of indie and alternative artists that they were about to sign that would just change the whole kind of way we looked at 4AD records. Bands like Throwing Muses, who feature on this compilation with the track Fish. The lyrics of Fish actually give the compilation its title. It features the line, Lonely As An Eyesore. You would also get very shortly after this, the Pixies releasing on 4AD, and Ultra Vivid Scene as well, another band of that period. Shortly after this compilation as well, just as more evidence of 4AD changing, you would get some of the kind of the first wave of UK shoegaze acts to emerge in that kind of late 80s, 90s juncture to sign to 4AD. So Lush and the Pale Saints are the two that spring immediately to mind there. Yeah, this is a really good compilation, and yeah, it features very, very typical 4AD artwork. That Vaughan Oliver style is immediately recognizable. These are the kind of things that would jump out at you when you were looking through records in a rack in a record shop. Okay, 88, a small one here on the Workers Playtime record. This is a UK indie label, which was, I think, quite heavily associated with alternative tentacles. So it's called Gruesome Stains, and it features kind of lots of punky, hardcore, kind of borderline metal kind of acts. So you get stuff like Doctor and the Crippins, Death by Milk Float, Jail Cell Recipes. Also in 88, we get the first compilation album released by Sarah Records, and it's called Shadow Factory. Yeah, Sarah Records I've touched on before. I think it was in the East River Pipe video of my 90s Overlooked Under Hood series. They're the archetypal kind of twee indie label for the UK. So this kind of very delicate, jangly, kind of shambly pop, as it got called, from Sarah Records based in Bristol. They released many other compilations over the years. Some of them would include Temple Cloud in 1990, Glass Arcade in 1991, Jail Ferry Bridge as late as 1994. And the label finally stopped, ceased to exist in 1995. The last compilation they ever released there was called There and Back Again Lane. Yeah, quite an important label kind of from a kind of a sonic and a cultural standpoint, I think, because they really kind of encapsulate a very specific kind of subgenre of the UK indie scene at that time. Another one from 88, and this on another very important UK indie label, we have Doing It for the Kids on Creation Records. Yeah, this was one of a long line of Creation compilations. They'd been releasing them since 1984 or thereabouts. They started with Alive in the Living Room. In fact, I think that may have been Creation's first LP release. There was Different for Domeheads in 1985. Purveyors of Taste in 86 and Doing God's Work in 87. So for some of these earlier compilations, you would have had very archetypally Creation sounding artists, very, very jangly, very shambly, very DIY, very loose kind of UK indie acts like The Pastels, like Biff Bang Pow, Felt, Momus, the Jasmine Minks. But by the time you get to Doing It for the Kids, you start to see, again, that change is coming, something is happening. You get My Bloody Valentine's first appearance on one of these compilations with their track Cigarette in My Bed, from the You Made Me Realise EP. You also get The House of Love with their track Christine from their debut album on Creation. But yeah, so I think this is the point around about 88 where Creation, again, like 4AD, would start to kind of shift and kind of follow the tastes that the kind of the indie artists of the day were creating. They seemed to be responding to the kind of the noise rock from the other side of the Atlantic, from bands like Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., Husker Du, and that was kind of the impetus for shoegaze, of which Creation Records was kind of a major part. The shape of kind of indie distribution did change somewhat with the kind of the collapse of the cartel. So I think you generally tend to see less of these kind of cheaply promoted kind of compilation albums the further you go into the 90s. A lot more kind of retrospective kind of best-ofs, people looking back and licensing other artists from the past, but not so many of these kind of, you know, let's gather a bunch of contemporary artists together and put them out on a record to kind of, you know, advertise them, if you see what I mean. There was one interesting phenomenon of the early 90s, and that was, well, the Peel Sessions. Peel Sessions had been running on John Peel's radio show for years and years and years. A band would go in and record like maybe 4 tracks at the BBC studios in a kind of a semi-live way, quick and dirty over the space of a day, and they would be broadcast on John Peel's radio show. What happened was, around about the mid-80s, these started being kind of issued as kind of 12-inch EPs on the Strange Fruit label. New Order, I think, was the first one in about 1986. One of their older sessions was released. And they had these very kind of generic, very easily recognizable sleeves. You know, you could spot a Peel session in a record rack straight away. They would pop immediately. But they were kind of generally, you know, retrospective in nature. These were kind of like, you know, old sessions being released. You'd get sessions by Gang of Four from, you know, the late 70s, or you would get Wire sessions or old Full sessions. There wasn't so much of a kind of an attempt to kind of issue Peel sessions of bands immediately as they'd been recorded. But as we moved into the 90s, you did see a few kind of label and kind of genre-specific Peel session compilation albums emerging. So the first is 1988, we see Hardcore Holocaust, and then in 1990, Hardcore Holocaust 2. These are both kind of grindcore, that kind of extreme metal kind of scene. John Peel loved this stuff. So you get bands like, Extreme Noise Terror, Bolt Thrower, Unseen Terror, Deviated Instinct. These were released as compilations kind of, quite shortly after they'd been recorded and released. Further on into the 90s, in 92, we get 3 different compilations, all kind of aligned with labels. There was the 2 Pure sessions, there was the Hut recording sessions, and there were the Amphetamine Reptile sessions. So on each one, you got a compilation of either one or several tracks from one or other of the bands on each of the labels. So for 2 Pure, you got the Faith Healers, Stereolab, PJ Harvey. For Hut, you got the Smashing Pumpkins, Revolver, The Verve, and Moose. And for Amphetamine Reptile, we got Cows, Helmet, Surgery, Tar. And then again, later, a couple of years later, 94, this is slightly more of a retrospective one, but we get the Sub Pop sessions, covering the period from 89 to 93. A selection of bands that were releasing on Sub Pop. You get Mudhoney, Tad, Seaweed, Pond, Velocity Guilt, Codeine, no Nirvana. They were far too big for that by then. But yeah, the Sub Pop sessions is another one of these kind of contemporary-ish Peel session compilations. So yeah, I think, differences between just the kind of the geography and the way that the UK and the US kind of independent record scene worked, differences aside, I think it's really nice to just be able to kind of pick up one of these compilations and just get a taste of the music of that specific time. Again, they're great kind of artifacts of the past, and at the time, they were just a very good, quick, cheap way of getting hold of a bunch of music that you might just be getting into, and you didn't have too much to spend. Yeah, in case you missed it, I do love a good compilation. There's just something very satisfying about having, a curated kind of list of really cool stuff that someone's kind of sweated over, kind of putting together for you. And I think in the case of a lot of these compilations, that feeling just really shines through. Okay, time to go. But before I do go, yeah, there's a few things down there that you can do, as always. You know the drill. But yeah, come back soon and we'll talk again. Bye for now.